if you start discussing data sovereignty and you only start looking at it from the technical perspective, which is, oh, okay, I have a data center here, I need to have a data center there, or I'm going to replicate my data and so on, I think that you're not necessarily starting on the right foot. It is absolutely essential to have the technical discussion, but you need to understand what are the legal implications of why, or rather, so first of all, why do you need to have data sovereignty in place? And what is the outcome you want to achieve of that? So it is a joint effort between your risk and compliance organization, your information security organization, and your IT organization.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Strive, the podcast where we explore what it means to be cyber ready, one conversation at a time. My name is Alex Zinin. I lead Commvault's service provider managed services business as well as our digital sovereignty initiative. This is the first episode in the Strive series on digital sovereignty. It's a topic that moved fast from being a simple compliance checkbox to something that company boards are generally wrestling with. I've been leading the company's sovereignty strategy for a while now, so clearly I have some opinions and understanding of where the conversations and frameworks are moving. We're moving right, moving wrong. But as we get into the depth of it, we will get into the architectures and design questions in the later episode. But today, I wanted to start the series by bringing an outside perspective. And our guest today is Max Mortillaro, who has been watching this space closely from the EMEA vantage point. And Max, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I wanted to start with the perspective on what sovereignty actually means. The word sovereignty is not new, but recently, over the last probably 2-3 years, it's been on the in the mouth of every hyperscaler and every service provider on their websites. But from your perspective, how you see that, what does it really mean? Sovereignty, what does it actually require legally, technically, operationally? What is your view on that high level?
Yeah, thanks again, and I hope that we're going to have some good opinions, because I'm also opinionated about that, so from different perspective. So the first thing I want to say, I'm working for Osmium Data Group, is that we are not a legal consultancy, right? So take anything I may say which has legal implication with a huge grain of salt, please. So if we look at it from a legal perspective, what we are talking about here is primarily looking at what is the jurisdiction in which the operations are happening, right? So if you're saying that you're a sovereign solution and you're based in France or in Germany, so my first expectation, the first thing I'm going to look like is, are you really operating from Germany or from France? That's what I would say, maybe to put it in plain words, right? So that's an important aspect. There are a lot of caveats to that. The other aspect is, of course, what does it mean? If we take sovereignty as a term itself, it means I am sovereign, I make my own decisions, I am not influenced by anything going on outside. Right, so that's what I would say to frame the legal aspect. From a technical perspective, there again, we might have some kind of lines blurring, and there we can say, what are we talking about? Are we talking about the location where a data center is technically located and built? Are we looking at the technology that is inside the data center? Are we talking about the hardware, about the software, the operating system? Are we talking about cloud services that are provided and so on, right? And we're also talking about the data, so there's quite a lot to kind of unpack here. Are we able to protect ourselves from foreign interference or not with this technology stack? And I mean, I could go on, but if we start with the definition here and we are going to end on what it means operationally, to me that means, how do we operate, how do we run this stack? And by how we run it, it means, what kind of people am I hiring inside the team? Are we kind of making them go through background checks? What are their citizenships? Is the team located here or is it located offshore, and so on? So there's quite a lot, but I hope that gives you already a bit of an idea of how I do see things, or how do we see things at Osmium with my business partner, Ariane Timmerman.
Thank you, Max. And I think it's going to be pretty much aligned with how we view that, because as we started to tackle the problem of sovereignty overall, we realized that, hey, look, it's not going to be a binary switch on or off, right? There is aspects, there is different dimensions of sovereignty. And for us, it was important to establish a common vocabulary, a common framework that we could apply actually to multiple different geographies, to different markets. And how we define it as a collection of main pillars: data locality, technological sovereignty, operational sovereignty, jurisdictional sovereignty, which I think is very much aligned with what you just described. But kind of as we analyze the different regulatory aspects and different approaches that countries and regions take, we pretty much map it to those four categories and we analyze it from that perspective. As you see it, Max, where do you think the organizations have most of the, or most likely have the blind spots, if we, as we think through the what sovereignty really means?
Well, it's going to vary from org to org, I guess. But I think that the most misunderstood thing when we hear, at least, big hyperscalers or CSPs talk about data sovereignty is the legal and jurisdictional aspect, right? We tend to see a lot of emphasis on we have a EU-based data center, we have EU personnel and so on. But when things go sour, you're going to get into litigation, right? And what is going to be the key thing here is, who's taking a decision to judge on what is right and wrong, and then who can apply pressure. And that we'll get to that later in the conversation about
Right.
geopolitical anxiety, as you very nicely put it. We're going to get into that. So I think that these are the key aspects, right? Technically, I think that everybody seems to understand what's going on. But over to you, because I think we have quite a lot to unpack today
That's
anyways.
right. That's right. Exactly. It's interesting. I think the notion of sovereignty is not a new one, right? We've seen sovereignty in the telecom environment where certain countries were, or vendors of the certain countries were prohibited from playing in the markets. We've seen GDPR, right, as maybe a certain aspect or flavor of sovereignty and so on. Do you see that those are related to each other with the sovereignty as we see today as well?
I would say that there is a kind of a link between those, at the very least, right? So, GDPR is a privacy and consumer rights protection law in the EU. And so it kind of dictates, how you handle customer data, what rights customers have. It also has some kind of implication from a data locality perspective, or rather cross-border sharing of the data. I mean, this is really controversial. There's been some, cross-border acts with the US, which were, then rebuked. But the relationship is there anyways, because you have legislation in the EU. So you have the GDPR, which is at the union level, and then you have
Yes,
specific country laws, right? You have the BDSG in
exactly.
Germany. I'll try to say it. Bundesdatenschutzgesetz. Right? I get bonus points for that. So it says where you store data from German customers. So you have a data locality obligation, and that data locality obligation is a sort of, sovereign requirement. You cannot store your data wherever you want. You may have, other sort of regulations that come into play here. So I would say that yes, there is a relationship somehow between GDPR and data sovereignty.
I wanted to talk about specifically what's happening in EMEA, right?
Mhm.
From your perspective, you're right in the middle there. What do you think is pushing EMEA right to the forefront of digital sovereignty? What have European governments, enterprises, overall the community, what have they learned about sovereignty that is so different from, let's say, North American or Asia Pacific or other markets, that is really pushing them to be very, very serious about it, especially in the last few years?
Yeah.
What's your
Wow.
view?
Okay. So that is a huge question, and I do have a long answer to that. But let's make sure you correct me so I'm not kind of missing the point, right? So we do have a thing we're acutely aware of in the EMEA region. We are not a technology leader on the hardware side, and we are definitely not a technology leader on the cloud side, and we are neither a technology leader on the software side, although we may want to argue around that, right? But overall, we are like every company in the world, we are using technology massively. It fuels all of our companies and systems and so on, and processes, business processes. But we do not own the stack. We have no control over that. So we are acutely aware that we are dependent on foreign technology. And the push for sovereignty wasn't that important still if you think about it a few years ago when we had, let's say, a relatively relaxed kind of geopolitical situation. And there's always been a sort of, cooperation, or would I say, competition is the right word, between the US and the EU, but it was rather, mild and in terms and so on. The changes we've seen recently on the politics side, and although I do follow geopolitics, I'm not claiming to be an expert here. I'll just focus on the technology side. We are in a situation now where anything can happen. We have no kind of limits or boundaries anymore. What seemed impossible could happen the day after, right? So organizations, especially governments, are also trying to figure out how do we hedge against that risk? Because in the end, my perspective on that, and one shared by Ariane as well, is that we see data sovereignty more as a kind of a risk-based topic for conversation, right? It's not just that much about the fact that we want to own ourselves. It's just that we want to continue doing business. We want to continue running the show without disruptions, right? So just like you will be doing disaster recovery, business continuity, this becomes part of that perspective. So I would say that this is kind of the main driver that we're seeing over there, right? If you think about,
Geopolitical. Hmm.
if you think about other, jurisdictions, other regions, it's somehow different. A U.S. company is totally oblivious to what we're talking about here. They have the technology, they have the government backing them, and so on. Business as usual, no problem. You're in North America, you're somehow bound to that big neighbor which is over there, and you don't have that much of a margin, to do things. The Latin American region, APAC, or even LATAM, APAC, and so on. There's something over there, but let's say they're not exactly into the same aspects. I mean, if you look at it again, I don't want to deep dive too much into that, but if you're located in the Southeast Asia, you do have ready access, to semiconductors and so on. So,
Right.
anyway,
Hmm.
let's
There's
maybe,
different aspects of
yeah, I
sovereignty
would
there,
say,
technological sovereignty.
yeah. So I would put it there. Maybe if you have a perspective on that specifically. I mean, if we align on views or if you see things differently.
Yes, definitely. I mean, there's definitely we see a lot more regulatory pressure, and I think the perception of the market is that the Europe EMEA perceives themselves to be much more exposed than in other
Mhm.
regions, right? And
Yeah.
there is more sensitivity there, which was driving an evolving set of regulations and government actions. And I meant to talk to you about this as well, since you're right in the middle of it. How do you see that progression and evolution of the regulatory framework? What's happening in EMEA?
So this is moving. This seems to be moving fast, maybe not fast enough based on, where you are. If you're on the hyperscaler side, you might be happy about that. If you're on the other end, you might not be happy about that. But we kind of start seeing some grassroots initiatives, by local governments or cities, larger cities that are taking action on their own and decide they're going to move to a specific stack. There was an initiative recently, I think couple months ago, from France as well, where they decided to build their own, open source based stack for government services. So this is clearly evolving, but not to the point maybe where there is a clear uniform regulation across the board at the EU level. That said, there are some regulations, I would say, around data sovereignty for cloud providers, but it's still kind of very disjointed. I mean, overall, I would say that uh, the overall feeling is a feeling of being threatened somehow, right? So we
Right.
realize that things could go wrong and soar quite fast.
And we see regulations evolving at the EU level as well as at the country level, as you said, right?
Yes.
Driven by different perspectives, I guess, and different
Mhm.
perception of the threat in each particular
Yes.
country. Yeah.
Exactly. And it's a very important thing to point out, right? The European Union is not necessarily a very solid and compact unified bloc. It's still made of, various countries, 27, 28, I forgot how many we have now, but anyways, a lot of different perspective. And you can see it in the context of the global tensions which are happening, for example, with the war in Ukraine or other things. The perspective, even though you would say that everybody's showing a unified bloc, the strategic perspective of a country like France is not necessarily the same as Germany has,
Right.
and so on, right? France has always wanted to have some kind of strategic autonomy on things. So this is really going to evolve, from country to country.
Right. And it does seem to me that it is there to stay. I mean, it's as you and I know, it is much easier to pass the regulation and legislation than to withdraw it. So that's why we're taking it so seriously. This is not just a temporary phenomena. It will
Mhm.
define the market for the foreseeable future. And what's interesting is also is that in your research, Osmium, you identified data sovereignty as one of the top trends, right, in the data protection trendscape. Is regulatory pressure the main drivers there? Do you think that it's ranking it so high, or is there something else there?
Well, there's the regulatory aspect is important. The
Clearly,
geopolitical anxiety, I love the way you put it. It's very, very, nice and fluffy, I would say even. I would say, yeah, the strategic, the geopolitical
politically
tension is very
correct.
important as well. But one thing to be said, in all fairness, right? The research and I mean, the goal, what we're doing is we're really trying to focus on giving an EMEA perspective to things, right? So that's the way we see things as analysts, and that's the way we see things in EMEA, right? So it's a perspective in the end. But from that perspective, yes, it is a blend of both regulatory pressure, which is, I would say, quite not there yet. It has started thanks to GDPR and those data,
Right.
locality requirements, but it's going to keep going on, and also the geopolitical tension. I think that when you see what the U.S. government has done, calling it U.S. government to simplify, right? But this order to disconnect that judge from the Hague from Microsoft 365, it might seem anecdotal, but I think it shows the power of what you can do. So, as someone in the executive branch of the U.S. government, you can impose on a multinational company that they have to cut access to a service. So we will get to that later, but you think about the implication of that at scale, right? So
Represents a
obviously, yes.
significant
Yeah.
risk.
Yeah, exactly.
Indeed.
So that is why we have flagged that as a very important topic for organizations. That's something we'll have
I think
to
this
address.
nicely leads into our kind of next section of the
Mhm.
ecosystem reality check.
Yeah.
In your research, you specifically pointed out like one of the conclusions is that any US operated cloud provider still carries residual sovereignty risk, regardless of where the actual data centers are located. Can you speak more about this?
Yeah. So again, with the disclaimer that we are not lawyers, right? Um, there are several aspects to that. The first one, we're getting back to what we discussed at the beginning. In fact, there is jurisdictional, right? So if you are incorporated, I don't know, typically in Delaware or one of those states which have very, very permissive laws, very much in favor of companies, then whatever happens, even putting aside the fact that someone will, flip the switch off and you're done with your whole cloud infrastructure, you need to deal with the legal implications in the United States. So the US law is in effect applying, and you may have some legal implications or legal obligations to fulfill, but this could be, and again, I'm not a lawyer, this could become null and void because you've voluntarily accepted by signing a contract with a US company or an end user license agreement that you will subject yourself to the regulation of that state or that country. That's the first aspect. The second aspect is if you think about the technical implications of what does it means, right? So uh, example, they say, yeah, we have a cloud which is running in the European Union. I'm not going to name any of the free hyperscalers or the 4, 5 plus which are around, but what is that really running entirely in isolation out of the European Union? By that, what I mean is that you might have backend dependencies that you're not aware of. So think about the fact that any US East 1 outage on Amazon is typically going to impact most, if not all, of Amazon AWS infrastructure, right? So is there anything that goes back to that? Even if we put aside the geopolitical risks, if there is something that happens in the US at the infrastructure layer, it might be cascading all the way down to the European Union. And then you have all of those other implications, which are about what services are sending that over there? Is there any telemetry data? Who are we employing, and so on? I mean, I could go on and on.
Right. Yes. Thanks, Max. It makes a lot of sense. And then what we've observed is also that there is two distinct approaches that companies take in the in offering the digital sovereignty offerings. One is to establish or attempt to establish local operations that get as close to qualifying for local sovereign offering as possible. The other is to rely on the local partners, such as service providers and so on. And by the way,
Yeah.
Commvault, we take both approaches simultaneously. We are deploying our Commvault cloud services within the sovereign offerings of the hyperscalers, and then we're partnering up with the service providers. I wanted to
Mhm.
know your view. How do these correlate? Are they addressing the same market? Are they going to be comparable? Is it going to be different from the perceptual standpoint? Like, what are your thoughts on the two approaches here?
I mean, I would say both approaches have their pros and cons. I mean, if you are the first thing is the economical aspect, right? If you have a huge contract with AWS, Microsoft, Google, and you have credits or whatever, then you've already kind of committed that money up front, or you are going to commit it anyways. It's budgeted, it's in your, sheets, whatever. So you have a rationale to kind of spend that money that is already committed versus going to a specific, local cloud provider, right? At the same time, you could argue, as we've already done a couple of times already in this conversation, the fact that it's not going to be 100% perfect. On the other hand, you might have some very specific stringent requirements, could be whatever regulated application, let's say, or you have super critical ultra sovereign requirements. And now we're talking about governments or the defense industry. We're not talking about, business as usual stuff. And there you may have a very vested interest in partnering with a country specific service provider that that has its people on the
Hmm.
ground, that historically has ties with the government or whatever. So I think that there is merit in considering both approaches and maybe
Right.
blending. The key thing is that there is no kind of perfect situation, right?
Definitely.
And yeah, I think we'll probably get to that because I have some ideas on what good looks like. So maybe we'll
It's
discuss
it's
it.
it's definitely not a binary switch, and there is,
Uh-huh.
my personal view is that there will never be 100% sovereignty, right? For
Yeah.
the topics that you and I discussed at the beginning of the global economy, global relationships and dependencies and so on. And our view is that the decision about which service to go with will be a business trade-off, a trade-off between the cost, the risks, and compliance, and the level of compliance and level of exposure. From your standpoint and what you are seeing, I'm sure you're engaged with a multitude of providers and potential customers, the end users in Europe. From your perspective, how do enterprises evaluate the services that they see? Let's say if I'm a CIO, CISO of a company, and a hyperscaler comes to me or a service provider comes to me, what are the pointed questions, the first order questions that I should be asking them, you think?
Yeah. So maybe I want to jump back on what you said before I get into your question, right? I think that there's one thing which I learned over my career in IT, starting from the humble, grassroots of being a system administrator who thinks that a technical solution solves everything. You always end up in the end discussing about business use case, efficiency of the solution, and how much money you can throw at the problem, right? And you inevitably get to the point where, yes, you could live in a perfect Goldilocks world or zone where you have the most sovereign solution, whatever, but is it economical to pursue? Does it addresses your business problems and so on, right? So if you're talking about you're hosting your application to book, I don't know, meeting rooms or coffee lunches or whatever in the cloud, I guess you don't really have a sovereignty problem to address, right? If you have very confidential plans about your business because you're competing against its Airbus, against Boeing, for example,
That's
you
right.
have a totally different challenge to sort out. So now getting back to your question, which is about what people are typically looking for. I don't have a crystal ball, unfortunately, but what we've seen at Osmium, when we engage with Ariane and others about, with the customers about what we see there, it kind of depends on the audience, right? I mean, here we are talking about CIOs and CISOs, and those people naturally have a kind of a business-oriented mindset, right? How do we help the business? How do we help sort out the problem? But it's going to depend on the audience. And if you are talking with IT people, they are typically going to an M&A guy as well. So we're typically going to start looking at, okay, what does it mean technically? What do we need to do here? What do so typically when the organizations are discussing about sovereignty, they're going to think about the data locality of the data center. They're going to take it as a geolocation thing. Is it located in Paris? Is it located in Frankfurt? Whatever. And maybe they're going to start thinking about some other collateral stuff like, data movement. Where are we replicating our data? I mean, that might be interesting in the context of cyber resiliency and so on, right? So
Right.
that's some of this stuff. But the thing that is sometimes overlooked is, what are we actually running in the cloud? Why do we need to put it here, over there, and so on? What kind of application we're running, right? So and I think that you mentioned that before we had the conversation, before we started recording, in the kind of concept for the idea of this episode, is the let me think on that. It was the part around what organizations should do. I think
Right.
that you can have a discussion with a service provider or a cloud provider or hyperscaler about data sovereignty, but I think that you first need to understand what you're trying to achieve, right? So if they come in and they tell you, yeah, we have a super new sovereign cloud, yeah, fine, let them talk, good. But I don't think that that's the right moment to start engaging them and having a deeper conversation. I think you need to start looking at what you have in-house and what you want to
That was my
address,
next
right?
question. Like if I'm a
Yeah,
CISO and hopefully you and
yeah,
I have given them enough information to now go back and look at whether they're doing things right.
yeah,
And let's say if I'm a CISO and I know like, oh my God, look, I haven't actually
yeah.
gone deep enough, right? So
Mhm.
is this where you start? Are you start with the applications, or maybe you start with different classes of data, how sensitive that those classes are, and so on? Like, yeah, maybe continue on your thought trail there.
Yeah. So there is a thing that Ariane coined, I think a few months ago, when we were having a conversation with some vendors, and the thing that he came up with was, you need to have a data strategy, and I think that's precisely that. I think you need to have a strategy in place around what kind of data, what kind of footprint you have in the organization. And of course, that always necessarily ties back to the business processes, the applications that you're running, and so on. You need to understand your landscape. What are the key business processes you're running, how they're critical to supporting your operations or not. So it is not very far away from what you would do in defending a business continuity plan in the end, right? Because you need to make sure that your business can operate, survive, and thrive in case of an adverse event. And if you
Right.
take the risk-based perspective, then data sovereignty event, data sovereignty risk is one of the risks, just like you could have a flood, a natural disaster, a terrorist attack, whatever happens. A data sovereignty attack, just like you have, criminal groups, you could have a state-sponsored denial of service by cutting your access to your cloud provider. If you look at it, from this
Exactly.
purely approach, and how do I defend against that? How do I understand? And to understand that, just like you do the same with your crown jewels and your applications, you are doing exactly the same when you start having the data sovereignty conversation with your
That's
partners
how
and
we're
cloud providers.
approaching as well. We think that as part of the sovereignty conversation, we absolutely have to address resiliency.
Mhm,
And this goes into both cyber resiliency and business resiliency overall. I mean, as you mentioned, the businesses need to be able to recover from the
mhm,
adverse type of events of different classes,
mhm,
including sovereignty related ones. And kind of going into, I guess, a little bit to my next question, ignoring cyber resiliency is one of the mistakes. Ignoring resiliency overall is one of the
mhm.
mistakes. Are there other mistakes that you would like to warn our listeners about that they should avoid as they get on the journey about sovereignty? What do you think?
Well, I was pointing out to that a bit in the beginning. Yeah, this is definitely not a technical only question. If you start discussing data sovereignty and you only start looking at it from the technical perspective, which is, oh, okay, I have a data center here, I need to have a data center there, or I'm going to replicate my data and so on, I think that you're not necessarily starting on the right foot. It is absolutely essential to have the technical discussion, but you need to understand what are the legal implications of why, or rather, so first of all, why do you need to have data sovereignty in place? And what is the outcome you want to achieve of that? So it is a joint effort between your risk and compliance organization, your information security organization, and your IT organization, right? The three need to work hand in hand. Whether you have a data compliance officer, a data officer, CDIO, whatever is the term these days, those people need to work hand in hand, and they need to work hand in hand in the benefit of the organization, right? So I would say, to me, that's the main maybe mistake or shortcut will be to treat this as a purely technical topic. It is not.
Exactly. Max, thank you so much. I know we only had 30 minutes and it's a huge area to cover in a short conversation like that. We will continue this series, but thank you, Max, so much. It's very insightful.
Thank you very
The
much.
the goal here is to decompose and kind of to separate marketing from reality and give our listeners, our viewers, a bit of a practical perspective of what sovereignty is really and is not, and how to approach it. And I think you did absolutely fabulously. Thank you, Max. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.